Yes, so good morning and welcome to day 2 of our conference on the theme Migration, Mobility and Forced Displacement. So if we take our seats for the second keynote address, this morning's keynote address is going to be presented by Loren Landau on the topic Temporality, Informality and Translocality in Governing Africa's Urban Archipelago. And Loren is the South African Research Chair in Human Mobility and the Politics of Difference, based at the University of Wits African Center for Migration and Society. He has previously held visiting and faculty positions at Princeton and then Georgetown Universities in the US and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He has published widely. And all I can say is if I want to go through the list of publications, we will not be done by midday. So I'll skip that. And then just add that he has an MSc in Development Studies from the London School of Economics, and then a PhD in Political Science from Berkeley University, also in the USA. So we invite Loren to come and give this morning's keynote. If you put your hands together to welcome our keynote speaker.
How do I make this go up there? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all. I notice a slightly diminished representation of the students here today. I hope that I won't take it personally. Among other things, social scientists carefully observe traditions and rituals, and while my published work has primarily been about African migration, urbanization, displacement, most of my time and most of the... Louder. The mic is in my face. Is it this one? Yeah. All right, is that better? Okay. I was just saying that most of my time sort of observing people is actually spent in places like this, sort of sites of academic exchange, and in trying to respect the traditions of our sort of extended and sometimes contentious family. I'd like to observe 2 rituals. So the first is to thank all of those who've got me here, and those of you who you can blame later for giving me this platform, which is Abina, Gordon, Stefan, Agnes, Francisca, Leander, of course, and many of my other colleagues at the Center for Migration Studies, which I've learned, who have taught me a lot over the years: Peter, Mariama, Joseph, Mary, Gosua, Tachwa, and also to Karina, who's sitting there, who's been my guide in Accra the last few weeks. The second tradition is to start a presentation like this with a story. And anthropologists are really the best at this, and there's almost always a kind of anecdote meant to evoke social realities about kinship or kingdoms that ultimately surprise and unsettle something that we've too long taken for granted or sort of simply overlooked. I too want to start with a story, but not a story of a person, which is what they usually do, but rather a story of tens of thousands of people. Rather, I want to begin a story with a story of a place. That's Diepsloot. This is located just north of Johannesburg, which is, of course, possibly South Africa's richest city. Diepsloot is now home to somewhere around 140,000 people, which is respectable as its own, but of course is just part of a city region that has about 10 million people. Gauteng region, which is Johannesburg, Pretoria, and all of these sorts of sites. Combined, that region produces somewhere around 10% of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. Right? Here's a picture of Diepsloot in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Before this, a year or two before, this was an empty field. And the name in Afrikaans means deep ditch. Very glamorous sort of place to build a settlement. It was intended as a transit camp for a few thousand people who were moved out of shacks that were regularly swept away by floods. Other spaces around the city have less organized origins, but are similarly sprung from a few self-built shacks to cities or suburbs in their own right. Here's what's happened to Diepsloot since then. And here's what Diepsloot looks like now. Right? Those original temporary houses are still there, but so too are thousands of other structures. This has created one of the most linguistically diverse spaces in the country. South Africa has 11 national languages, and all of them are spoken, represented here on a daily basis. But so too are the languages of Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Somalia, and occasionally countries from Southeast Asia. This, like many sites or communities or places around the continent, are places that attract people from everywhere, but where almost no one is from. The malls and the shopping centers moved in long ago to make money off this population. The police station only opened last year. Now let's look at another site, less than a kilometer away from Diepsloot. This is one of the wealthiest Johannesburg suburbs. It is also one of the least linguistically, class, and culturally diverse. These places, Dainfern and Diepsloot, look like different worlds, but they are perhaps best seen as conjoined twins. Each depends on and in turn reproduces the other. So this is a kind of kinship story after all, right? Part of an emerging and expanding network of sites connected and reproduced through multiple, often antagonistic ties. Here's another scene from Johannesburg published a couple weeks ago in Time magazine. Each city is unique, but the story of tremendous, rapid growth and spatial inequality is not. The story of multiple sites connected through material and moral economies is the emerging norm. Sometimes, as in the case of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, which is here in the lower left, a border formally separates what is essentially an inseparable social and economic world. More often, it is forms of urban planning or social distinctions that maintain these conjoined divisions. It is these patterns that will characterize the cities which are our global future. Long ago, the world entered the urban age. Over the next decade, Africa too will cross the tipping point, as it were, in which the majority of the population is urban. In many countries, this has already occurred. Even if its plots suggest the relative weight of cities is sometimes overblown in our discussions, there's no doubt that their populations are growing. As scholars of human mobility, we often quickly assume that migration is behind this growth. However, most of it is due to people living longer and this, at least to demographers, somewhat surprising persistence of high fertility rates. Some of it is simply an artifact of reclassification, people being labeled as urban even though they've never moved. By some estimates, only about a quarter of urban growth is due to migration. Most of this is due to people within national borders. But if we drill down below the city level, we see neighborhoods filled with significant numbers of people who have recently moved, even if it's just from another part of the city or somewhere upcountry. Sometimes they come from the same place, often they are from multiple places. Here they converge, however temporarily, in a single site. I've taken to calling these urban estuaries as a way of capturing the multiple movements in, through, and out of these places, and the kind of distinctive social ecosystems that they produce. Some people fear these movements and the kind of Malthusian dystopians they evoke. Others celebrate mobility and the social dynamics behind it. Talk of hybridization, mongrelization are exciting, and there is great space for exploring emerging forms of cosmopolitanism practiced in multiple socioeconomic and geographic scales. We heard a little from Nunu yesterday about some, but we can go and find this too in the slums. The socially corrosive power of cities offers new possibilities for African youth culture, artistic expression, and a variety of newfound freedoms. Although moral economies have a way of traveling with us, cities almost inevitably offer women, for example, unprecedented opportunities to escape certain forms of place-based patriarchies. 3 decades ago, Louise White remarked on the potential for women to control and benefit from their sexual labor in colonial Nairobi, a challenge to male control of women's sexuality and autonomy. Migration and urbanization remain powerfully unsettling processes that offer moments, sometimes fleeting, to renegotiate generational and gendered hierarchies, ethnic or religious affiliations, and potentially escape from political patronage and domination. The possibilities for LGBTQ Africans, or for couples who love across ethnic, linguistic, racial, or religious boundaries, are real. Whether you see these changes as good or bad, such reconfigurations are unsettling to those whose status depend on preserving the status quo. Around Africa and around the world, we have seen various reactionary responses in both sending and receiving communities. But try as they may, maintaining the status quo has ceased to be a possibility. One of the changes such rapid urbanization has instigated is the partial rescaling of formal politics. Migration and immigration were once issues nested almost completely in national planning commissions, home affairs, immigration bodies. While they retain formal control over immigration, cities are increasingly part of the conversation. In some instances, they protest overtly xenophobic or racist national policies. Sometimes, as in the case of Johannesburg, they call for greater restrictions. Either way, they must cope with the people who have arrived on their doorsteps. Through Habitat 3 and the Sustainable Development Goals and other initiatives, the UN has come to the party. In its typical fashion, it offers ill-defined utopian imperatives, in this case, to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Habitat, of course, has long called for cities without slums. This complements a common refrain one hears from activists and academics that everyone, regardless of their age, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, profession, etc., has a right to the city. I suspect few of us, at least instinctively, would reject such calls, but perhaps we should address them more carefully. Of course, I'm not advocating exclusion of any kind, but we should consider what some of these terms actually mean and how they may work both for and against the people that concern us. For the next 25 minutes or so, that's precisely what I want to do. So, let's start with what we mean by a city. And this may seem like something of a trick question, but I think if we start to look more deeply, there's a lot we have to answer for. Are these cities? Is this what they look like? This is the sort of classic city, as it were. These are almost ideal types, cities that were at the heart of modern urban, sociological, and political theory. These cities informed the work of Marx, Simmel, Durkheim, and Weber. These cities informed the Chicago School of Sociology. They were where we learned about ghettos and migrant enclaves. They were the reference points for scholars who conducted groundbreaking work on urbanization and social transformation in Africa during the late colonial and early post-colonial period. For better or worse, they are often still our reference points. These are global, world cities with distinctive pasts. They are cities forged through processes of industrialization. They grew together with the growth of industry and states. They turned peasants into factory workers. As Eugene Weber reminds us, they turned peasants into Frenchmen and to Englishmen and Germans. In the case of New York and Chicago, they turned people from across the world into Americans. The tandem of state and industry disciplined people, created classes, created national identities, created a modern civic citizenship. The regular call of the factory whistle helped standardize time and created distinctive modes of living and working with strangers. It was from these centers that states developed the social and material resources to broadcast their power, to launch navies, to control their borders and hinterlands. These are the birthplace of modern capitalism, modern states, and some would argue modern democracy. These old industrial cities remain, although they are being transformed by competing processes of gentrification and precaritization. But let's put those aside for now, since they are not the only kind of cities that we've got. Elsewhere in the world are cities of different kinds. These cities incorporate and exceed the visual vocabulary of their elders, all filled with skyscrapers, subways, shopping malls, lots and lots of shopping malls. They are wealthy cities, but not aimed at elevating or empowering the domestic population, or for the most part, the domestic economy. They are entrepôts and global points of exchange formed through global circulations. They are nodes of social and cultural movement. To varying degrees, they rely on migrants from across the country, their countries, and around the world. In many of the Gulf states, of course, foreigners far outnumber citizens, sometimes by 5 to 1. Radical social diversity is the norm in these places, but typically managed under watchful authoritarian eyes. They are central to national economies, but their leaders are often only marginally concerned with the welfare of those outside the city, and for the most part, with the poor people who live within them. The rural hinterland or peasantry matters little except as a source of raw materials and labor. The cities are symbols of national pride, but politically disconnected from the lives of citizens outside of the city. They are the spaces of global circulation commented and often condemned by critical Marxist scholars like Sasson, Davis, Harvey, and a myriad of others. But where in sub-Saharan Africa do we find either the old industrial cities or the deeply networked globalized cities that we've just seen? Richard Stren has argued that Nairobi, in fact, is Africa's most global city, not because of industry or trade, but as a center of the United Nations and NGO activity. And if you look, I don't know if you can see carefully, in the middle of the Kinshasa Main Street it seems like a stalled UN vehicle. Johannesburg might be a candidate, but its extraordinary population growth that I showed you earlier has been accompanied by declining industrial and entry-level opportunities. Perhaps Luanda, it is a city of great oil wealth and an ever-growing population. By some calculations, it has become the most expensive city in the world, besting New York and Tokyo. But its geography echoes that of the fragmented contemporary urbanism I showed you earlier. Wealthy enclaves surrounded by seas of shanties. It too remains disconnected from its hinterland and its citizenry, benefiting and accumulating wealth only for the rich. For the most part, African cities reflect urbanism of a different kind. They are growing rapidly, rates akin to industrial Europe 150 years ago, or the globalizing industrializing cities in Asia, but these are cities with only limited industry, limited trade, limited possibilities for a secure life. In the words of Kiata and Mumyeba, these are not productive cities, they are consumptive cities. Some find fortune there, but most do not. Yet these are not simply Malthusian, chaotic sites. On average, people in the cities live longer and have more possibilities than those elsewhere. For most, cities reflect possibility amidst precarity. Health, wealth, security, onward movement, profit, protection, passage, these are things that you may not get, but are only available in the cities. But they offer few promises. African cities are physically, economically, and existentially risky. They may lure with liberation and transformation, but they demand people radically alter their life scripts. People must surrender predictability. Life stages and rites of passage remain important markers of success and normative guides, but the path through them is rife with meanders, roundabouts, and dead ends. These are cities of uncertainty, where the majority of Africans will spend at least part of their lives. The last urban space I wish to discuss is this one. This is a place most of you will never have heard of, Sagana in Kenya, but is like thousands of others that you will have seen. How, I'm sure you're asking yourself, is this a city? There are no buildings, no shacks, no factories, no port, not even a shopping mall. That much is true, but these kids' uniforms were paid for by relatives living in Nairobi. The kids down the street probably had their uniforms paid by relatives working in London or elsewhere, or running businesses in Atlanta. The land on which they live is owned by people who spend most of their lives in the city. Whereas the peasants who became Frenchmen in Paris were pushed off their land, many Africans retain strong connections to the soil. This has become something of a cliched trope, but it is one worth considering. Urban dwellers may rarely see the trees and bushes, but their families live there, their money goes there, and ultimately they may seek respect and status in these sites. It remains central to moral and material economies. With insecure earnings in both farms and cities, individuals and families spread their risk, creating household economies that rely on spatial and professional diversification. Sons and daughters are sent to be educated elsewhere or to earn. They may never permanently return, but the connections typically remain strong. Does this mean that bucolic Sagana is a city? Well, that's probably a stretch, But just as Diepsloot and Dainfern are conjoined twins, so too is Sagana and Nairobi, or maybe it's triplets or quintuplets. Given the multiple scales of connections forged through mobility of people and products, the connections are hard to quantify, but central to the future shape of cities and the people who live there and who live elsewhere. A couple of years ago, Brenner and Schmidt argued that the rural has effectively ceased to exist. They speak of planetary urbanism, in which every rural area had effectively become simply a space of production and investment for city-based people and processes. It is these connections that they've reflected in this map behind me. I struggle, of course, as I'm sure many of you will, with their kind of universalist, materialist vision, but in an era in which translocal material and moral economies are the norm, there is a need to rethink the boundaries of a city and the boundaries of the rural. Understanding contemporary and historical mobility and urbanism means rescaling in two directions. On one hand, to the translocal and global, and another to the hyperlocal, not just to take cities seriously, but to understand the neighborhood, an enclave as small as a building or a street. It is by doing this that Atok Quezon offers such a powerful account of Oxford Street, just a few kilometers from here. Looking at Oxford Street, Diepsloot, or any number of other urban estuaries, we begin to see that what is emerging across Africa is more than the simple translocalism fostered by long-standing patterns of oscillating movements, or what Potts calls partial urbanization. These patterns continue, but current African migration and mobility are more intense and diversified. More importantly, past patterns formed around and helped to ensure predictability. They remained primarily dyadic. These more archipelagic forms of membership reflect economies and institutions both fragile and fragmented, connections more dispersed. Even those who never move far from their birthplace, root themselves permanently in urban space, or find themselves entrapped in what has become a kind of refugee urbanism, become inscribed in multiple sites and emerging translocal imaginaries. Such inscriptions offer global imagination filled with possibilities, both real and elusive. These produce longings and frustrations, an awareness of processes and possibilities elsewhere, and of the barriers to accessing them. Geographic movements are shaped by these varied imaginations, visions of home, diaspora, and what Mbembe and Nuttall term multiple elsewheres. Even the most seemingly materially untouched sites, the remote village we spoke of earlier, are rapidly becoming parts of continental and global archipelagos, islands of space and time interconnected through material exchange, social recognition, moral disciplines, and future imaginations. However distorted, images, news, monies, goods, and gadgets continually arrive from elsewhere. Those on the receiving end embed them in spatialized practices and perceptions. These shape imaginations of what's possible and generate metrics of success and measures of failure. This leaves few people across Africa self-contained, free of dependence on money, information, or status from other spaces and time. These movements and orientations give rise to life courses that are at once rooted in the everyday materiality of specific sites, but are decidedly translocal. People may not travel far, but the circulation of materials and moralities keep them connected. This presents scholars with multiple empirical challenges. How, for one, do we make sense or speak of economies or systems of belonging that span multiple temporalities and spaces? What does ethnography become when people's lives are so embedded in spaces that you cannot visit, or people's lives may be implicitly shaped by sites they have never seen or may never reach? And what does political participation or representation, all things we generally value, come to mean for transient or translocal peoples? It also raises conceptual questions about the meaning of inclusion and normative questions about its desirability for the people we study. The understanding of inclusion that typically informs most policy approaches, from urban vision plans to the SDGs, draw inspiration from industrial cities in North America and to some extent Latin America. Underlying these are the desirability of urban solidarity and membership that are often remarkably place-bound, visions that seem remarkably anachronistic for those living in estuaries or archipelagos. Lefebvre's famous demand that workers have rights to the city is premised on their contributions to building this infrastructure and wealth, and on the ideal of urban ownership. For him, for the drafters of the SDGs, or the forces behind Habitat 3's demand for urban inclusion, are ideals of localized belonging, of representation and visibility, of recognition and status where you are. They work from an ethics of inclusion that presumes people wish to remain, that their futures, whatever shape they take, are where you find them. Last year, Oliver and I published this book, very expensive book, very poor selling book. But it is a book filled with stories of migration and exclusion. And one thing that it makes clear is that models of place-bound incorporation, assimilation or integration, whatever language you want, are no longer adequate as either empirical or ethical guide. We increasingly see various forms of fragmented yet connected systems of moral authority centered on individuals who are nodes in networks spanning space and time. Vivek and her colleagues, for example, describe the position of a local authority figure, Alhaji Abdullahi Salihu Olowo, whose title is Oba Yoruba Kano. In order to maintain traditional loyalties in his hometown, Ilesha, where he has never lived, Olowo holds chieftaincy titles, but accepted the Hausa Muslim turban as a symbol of authority to rule over the Yorubas in Kano. Those under his leadership remain villagers of a certain kind with urban futures, urbanites who must simultaneously maintain status in multiple sites, some urban, some rural, where they may have never been or simply occasionally visit. Elsewhere, people attend churches, go to community meetings, or help repatriate corpses to maintain their status in villages they otherwise visit only now and then. Disconnection from these distant relatives and projects not only separates them from ancestral sites, but can alienate them from those embedded in translocal systems of economic and social generation. Offending people at home can close urban opportunities just as easily as shame shared in an urban space blocks the possibility of eventual return. In spaces where people straddle multiple, distinct yet connected social worlds, status and stigma travel, shaping what is possible and what is required of you. What we are beginning to see is what I've taken to call configurations of archipelagic belonging and inclusion. Rather than seeing inclusion as something negotiated at the scale of the city alone, people seek varied forms of recognition and membership in multiple places simultaneously. This creates conduits among a street corner in Nairobi with a village in Somalia and a mosque in Minnesota. It may connect a small shop in Johannesburg to a relative's house in Kinshasa and a wealthy uncle in Belgium. It may link a crowded shack in Old Fadama with villages on Ghana's northern border and a global trade in scrap metal. These are small islands of membership in which people negotiate recognition and inclusion. Sometimes these negotiations are simultaneous, as with the urban worker who constantly monitors the status of her peas or building project back home while building a life in the city. They may also work on multiple temporal scales, where life in the city is simply about waiting, about passing time in order to reclaim or to claim status elsewhere. Pentecostalism, one of Africa's most muscular social forces, is perhaps the greatest driver or a key part of this archipelagic belonging. A large number of the churches build on the strong connections to institutions in Nigeria, Ghana, Congo, and the United States. For many of the church's founders across Africa, many of whom are themselves migrants, their current pulpit is merely a place where they can enter a global social universe. In the words of a Nigerian pastor at the Mountain of Fire and Miracles Church in Johannesburg, Africa is shaped like a pistol. I should be saying this with a heavy Nigerian accent, but I can't do that, right? Africa is shaped like a pistol. Nigeria is the trigger, and South Africa is the mouth from where you could shoot out the word of God. Their preaching is often extraterritorial, overtly denying the legitimacy of state laws while speaking of the dangers of local connections. Both the state and the sullied, who are the majority of the people you live amongst, are enemies of salvation. As they pray, parishioners draw on liturgical language to make demands on cities while locating themselves in an ephemeral, superior, and unrooted condition in which they can escape localized social and political obligations. This is a kind of particularistic parochial cosmopolitanism that is not necessarily grounded in normative ideas of openness, nor is it intended to promote universal values of any kind. Rather, they co-opt the language and imagery of global cosmopolitan elites, planes, cars, mansions, endless travel, to position themselves as global players through discourses melding the individual with distinct and indistinct spaces in this world and the next. Their churches in Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg connect those cities with others in Alabama or the Parisian banlieues. Such an approach often leaves them, as I believe they intend, betwixt and between, without being liminal, participating in many worlds without being part of any of them. As I've noted, archipelagic imaginations include trajectories and markers of progress often closely associated with geographic mobility, a move to the city, a move across borders, a journey to Europe or America. Yet due to economic circumstances, most notably the precarity and absence of employment and restrictive immigration policies, people experience what Ramakrishnan terms spatio-social disruption. Under such circumstances, people may move with expectations of improvement, but feel unable to reach the next milestone of success. Without such achievements, they cannot return home, but nor can they move forward. Others simply wait for the state or others to provide, as if by miracle. Katz characterizes Sudanese youth living in Khartoum as being marooned by modernity. Jeffries talks of time pass. People can remain stuck in time, experiencing endless empty days peppered with panic for not having reached their geographic or material aims. Yet they resist rooting amidst the shifting sands that they live in for fear that doing so will end their journeys and surrender the possibility of success. In summary, we are seeing cities with ill-defined boundaries, with people both struggling for and actively resisting inclusion. Some seek status where they are, but are stymied by economic structures that work against them. Others actively resist incorporation, seeking a kind of distantiated deferral in which they seek recognition and futures elsewhere in the archipelago. For them, visibility, group membership, political participation, cross-cutting social ties, exactly the forms of inclusion scholars and activists almost universally celebrate, become forms of entrapment. Rather than rights to the city, which is effectively a right of ownership and rooting, many want what I've termed usufruct rights, trying to turn parts of the cities into the nowherevales that Bauman talks about, a place where almost no one is from and almost no one wants to be. It is possible, of course, that the churning we now see, this kind of processes that I've described, are simply a phase, and that given time, they'll work themselves out and form into the kind of solidarity and political communities we see elsewhere. But there are really few reasons to believe that this will be the case, and I expect that translocal or oscillating lives, diasporic imaginations, and deterritorialized politics may become the new normal. Without muscular states or industries, what will be the force for bonding and binding populations? Where are the police in Diepsloot? As the Kamarovs remind us, even the cities where modern sociology began, Chicago, London, New York, are increasingly looking like the kind of fragmented, precarious spaces I've been droning on about. Now on to our last term, which I'm sure comes as a relief to most of you. As with the other terms, sustainability has almost as many meanings as there are people who use it. Whether it is ultimately about environmental protection, social cohesion, planning and service provision, it often evokes a kind of stability, a sedentariness. When we think about urban sustainability, we tend to think of strong, locally oriented communities seeking to ensure the future of their next generation in situ. The goal of secure futures may be universal, but what does it mean to think about people negotiating futures at multiple geographic and temporal scales simultaneously? What does it mean to ask a person whose goal is living elsewhere to invest locally when her primary concern is to get somewhere else and to get out? What does urban sustainability even mean when a city is so internally divided and its borders so ill-defined? Who sets the standards? Where do we draw the boundaries? In whose interests will sustainability serve? Clearly, local governments are facing multiple challenges in responding to these challenges. and to mobility. There are questions of jurisdictions and budgeting. The processes that shape social and economic lives of cities are increasingly taking place outside of urban authorities' jurisdiction. These include national policies and global supply and labor chains. And we need to ask what systems of state resource distribution make sense when people forge lives in multiple locations, but our systems are based on single jurisdictions. Where people live such lives, intervening in particular spaces with the intention of reaching specific people can be like hunting in the dark. It's possible you hit the target, but you may miss entirely. What you do may have little impact or potentially deleterious consequences for those you intend to assist. Perhaps more importantly, these spaces are rarely functionally governed by law or formal policy. Even in South Africa, which some would argue is Africa's strongest state, rights and livelihoods are not negotiated through the law, but are negotiated on the ground through a panoply of rationalities and calculations, sometimes involving law and state actors, but not usually in predictable ways. For those concerned with fostering social cohesion or integration, what does it mean when you have people living together with multiple temporal and spatial trajectories? What does it even mean to talk about community? Who, moreover, in a place like Diepsloot, even qualifies as the host population? Who are the migrants? Without this distinction, most of our tools, philosophical and ethical, make no sense. It makes little sense in these spaces to speak of integration, hospitality, or welcome. Indeed, there are also questions for what this means in terms of the right to the city in Africa's urban areas. First, it asks us to rethink the geographic scales of justice. Harvey and Lefebvre's reading of the city is rooted in a Marxist understanding of labor and capital and the belief that rights to the city belong to those who labor in it. But what if cities were built on the back of workers elsewhere? Or what if there is no labor? What if cities are effectively do-it-yourself urbanism, built by the people who live there as temporary shelters? The question then is, can we envision a right to the city that moves beyond its geographic boundaries to incorporate the places outside of it that have made it possible? For an African city to be just, it cannot only be for those who live in the city, but for all those who need to come to it from elsewhere or who depend on the resources that it generates. It must be open to all, indefinitely, and for those who live elsewhere. Second, we need to shift the metrics of urban development, how we measure success. For a city to be accessible and inclusive and just, we must first understand how people seek to use the city to realize their aspirations. This is not to say that slums, informal settlements, and these gateway areas are perfect, for clearly they're not. But it is to recognize, as Huxmeyer and others do, that these spaces work for the poor because of their low entry costs and enable people to access and move through the city, which allows them to fulfill their objectives elsewhere. Pushing for the provision of urban amenities, housing, land titles, water, inadvertently raises the prices of these places and makes the city inaccessible to the poor. And what kind of inclusion is that? Third, we need to rethink the ethics and practices of urban participation and representation. As I've talked about before, participatory planning has become an almost universal mechanism for realizing democratic local government. Despite its inclusive and just ethos, participation can create incentives for excluding the interests of migrants coming to the city or for those who are simply moving through it. Typically, those participating in these planning processes will not ask municipalities to dedicate resources to future residents when they themselves face acute immediate needs, nor will the people who intend to leave even come to these meetings. The new arrivals are often unpopular outsiders because of their ethnicity, their religion, their poverty, only heightens the possibility that they'll be excluded from these processes. Such conditions demand we rethink the ethical and practical basis of political representation, membership, and inclusion. For many residents, inclusion is not about ownership and belonging, but about, as I said, usufruct rights, the ability to live in and extract from the city without being bound by it. In an era of informalized work and regulation, a focus on law and formal migration policy, something that we do here, even if done at multiple scales, is inadequate to explain economic or social outcomes. Instead, we must understand that the migration experience simultaneously across multiple geographic and temporal scales, and look at the regulations, both formal and informal. At the very least, these realities require from us a more substantive understanding of the multiple trajectories under which urban residents are living their lives and the spatial and temporal horizons that inform them. This means new forms of research, it means new forms of engagement. Perhaps most importantly, it requires constant self-reflection on the societies we want versus the societies we are likely or could possibly get. Until we reconsider what we mean by justice, by inclusion, by sustainability, we risk building cities and migration policies that only exacerbate the inequality and exclusion that we say we seek to address. So let me end there, and I look forward to any discussion that we can have. Thanks. Can I sit? Yes. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much, Loren, for this insightful presentation. It's been wide-ranging, covering different aspects of cities, drawing examples from the African context, and then also making some suggestions, practical suggestions as to how we appreciate cities, and probably going forward how we can research into city planning, and then those who dwell in them and those who depend on these geographical locations for their sustenance. So I will now open up the floor for questions. As is the tradition, we will take the first question from the summer school, and then any other questions. We'll take 3 questions at a time, and then the presenter gets to address them. And depending on the time we have, we'll go 2 or 3 rounds, time permitting. So the first question from someone who is part of the summer school, please. Sorry, before you ask a question, can you please introduce yourself, the institution you are coming from, and then you keep your question brief as much as possible so that we can maximize the time we have, the limited time we have. Thank you. Summer school. All right, so then we open it up to anyone who has a question. It doesn't have to be someone from the summer school. So if you take it to the front seat. Yes. Sorry. Yes, part first. Excuse me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Loren, for a really thought-provoking presentation. I think overall what I'm trying, what might take me a bit longer to digest is an intention I appreciate, which is to sort of address both conceptual ideas on how to bring our more academic research forward, but also how to connect those ideas to policy and planning. And overall, I think in migration research, that is always kind of, and perhaps in urban research as well, is a struggle, because there's sort of a trade-off sometimes between trying to sell advanced or nuanced conceptual ideas, and then also to make them applicable or understandable to policymakers, and even sort of, yeah, people who are not as interested in the conceptual details, right, and the nuances, but need more sort of practical ideas. So I appreciate the intention to keep that dialogue open, but I'm also struggling with, so for example, in African urban research, there's been this tendency to celebrate the ingenuity and the capabilities of urban residents themselves to improvise and make the best of difficult circumstances. And in one way, that is, of course, also a way of removing focus or responsibility from governing structures or service providers, or whatever you want to call it, right? But how is there a trade-off between acknowledging urban residents' own abilities to build the city from below through, this idea of people as infrastructure, for example? Is there a trade-off between that sentiment and then the more politicizing, critical, structural analysis? Is there a trade-off between the attention to the complexity of urban life, despite the structural deficiencies on the one hand, and then this more structural political argument on the other hand?
Thank you, Jesper. There was a hand at the back, please. Benjamin, did you want to ask a question? Okay. Then if you cross over to the left, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Elliot Eyebi. I'm a postdoc researcher. I'm social anthropologist and urban planner. I was very, very fascinated by your presentation and also by your analysis. I have two questions. First one, maybe more general, is as you mentioned, the African urban archipelago, as you said, what is the link that you made between this concept and the more known concept of global cities from Saskia Assassins, or also generally the work on the city of some researcher like David Harvey? The second one is, do you think that the African cities development or urban planning will follow the same path between the major cities as Johannesburg, maybe Cape Town, Lagos, and others, between these major cities and the second scale cities as ville secondaire? And the last one, I would like also to have your impression about the politics of evictions that we remark in many cities, in particular in West Africa, for what I know, since around 10 years, where you have the state which tries with violence to evict people, to remove not only migrants, but every person who cannot live with the sustain, not to say, who are not very rich, to live in the center of cities. So what do you think about this politics and the possible influence in the cities growing in maybe for the couple years coming? Thank you very much.
Thank you. A third question? Yes, if you cross over to Naya, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Loren, for a really great presentation, and also very beautifully made with all the photos. So I'm Naya Kleis from the Danish Institute of International Studies and with MIASA, and I have two questions concerning belonging and inclusion. So the first is, I was curious about a place like Diepslot with all the diversity. So in this place, is there a sense of like common belonging or affiliation to that place, or is it more like scattered groups in terms of interactions and a sense of affiliation and belonging to a place like that? And the other question is, I would like to link it to the keynote yesterday about diaspora and diasporization. So there we heard about how the term is mainly used in relation to like more established elite groups of migrants in Western countries. So what about African cities in relation to that? Do we also see processes and claims about diaspora and diasporization there? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll pause and then the keynote speaker will address the questions, and then we'll take a second round.
All right, when you say I address them, I think you're being overly optimistic. Let me try to just do them in order. Because I think the question, Jasper, you ask is a big one of how do we take conceptual things or even empirical research that raises questions and translate it. And more importantly, I think, is this sort of celebration of the local, potentially enable a kind of neoliberal politics of, well, the people must do it for themselves. And clearly that's the case. Many times I've been torn in trying to address this because when states do intervene, they're not going to intervene for the people that we care about, right? And so even in terms of policy engagement, a lot of my colleagues and I often talk about a kind of benign neglect. Like, it would be better to have the state do nothing than to do what they're going to do, because their vision of upgrading, their vision of engaging in these spaces is precisely what our colleague over here has said, which is to get rid of them, right? And if the alternative is closing these spaces to the poor or allowing them to exist as they are, then we go with letting them exist as they are. But I think you're absolutely right to always be asking what sort of politics does what we're saying enable? Just as we were speaking yesterday, that a kind of politics focused on the vulnerability of migrants ultimately can enable very restrictive policies against them. And that we do have a responsibility to think through those things. In terms of your question about what's happening in cities, I mean, I think that I was engaging to some extent with the global city literature that you're speaking about, the Harveys and the Sassons and others. My problem with them is that they don't really talk about African cities because they don't see them as global cities, apart from maybe Lagos or others, because they're not connected in the same way to the systems of trade and exchange that a Shanghai or elsewhere. And that kind of leaves them out of those maps. This is why Richard Stren was like, well, we can still talk about Nairobi as a global city because there's lots of NGOs in the UN there. You're trying to insert an African city into that discussion. I think when you start to look at these, but the problem is that they're Marxist and they're materialists, right? And so what they look at is the exchange of how capital works, how the exchange of goods and supply chains. I think that you get a very different map when you start to look at social connection and the sort of often more informal exchange of materials that happened at a personal level in forms of remittances, in the forms of other kinds of goods sent back. And that's where you start to see quite a different sort of map. And I think that part of the work we're doing is trying to correct what I see as the shortcomings in that global city literature. I think they tend to talk about cities as if they're one thing. And I think what we need to see, and this gets to the question of diaspora also, is that it's not a city connected to another city. It's a street corner connected to other parts of the city, connected to a specific street corner in another city, or to a part of a village, or to some specific street corner in Belgium or the United States. Right? And that we need to rescale that kind of discussion of diaspora, which tends to be very vague, and understand the very site-specific nature of the connections and the way in which those sites are part of these, what I've been calling archipelagos, which is why I picked that as a sort of chain of connected islands that are at once both distinct but also somehow connected and mutually generative. I really thank you for the question about secondary cities. I think they are probably, they will be even more extreme to some extent than the examples I suggested, because they are the fastest growing parts of Africa. And these are cities that are growing extraordinarily rapidly, sometimes, I mean, with rates you can't even imagine, with almost no industry or employment and almost no formal institutions, right? These are cities that will be do-it-yourself urbanism, whether we want that or not, just because the pace of growth is so great and the resources are so few. And I think if we're interested in looking at where new social movements, new social forms are going to come, it's going to be in those places, largely outside of the state, the kind of organizing that takes place in there. And like you say, at this point, the states really only know how to respond to those through evictions. And part of the policy engagement is to say, look, this is the kind of society you're going to get. Right? As I concluded, when we speak to urban planners, their visions of the city, those vision documents for Joburg, for Nairobi, for a number of others, they are cities without poor people, right? That is the city vision of almost every African city leader and mayor. Some of them have pictures of monorails, beautiful gardens, etc. Those are the cities they desire, because those are the cities that their wealthy people want. They're already building those cities on the outskirts of Luanda, Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, those cities that are these sort of ideal spaces for the rich. The question is, how do we engage and think about what a city where most of the people are going to be poor and are going to stay poor? What is cities going to look like? And I think that's an open discussion. So now, in terms of belonging, the research that we've done, the kind of survey work in these places like Diepsloot, but in Johannesburg and Maputo, in Nairobi, we ask people, do they belong to associations? Do they identify with the place? And they don't. It's obviously the place is important. It structures their lives, but we look at membership, even rotating credit associations, ethnic associations, all of the things we learned from Chicago school that they should be doing as immigrants. They're doing none of them. The only thing that they join are churches, right? It's the only institution that gets money, and that's across the continent, right? Most of the money goes home or is saved to get somewhere else or spent to just get to work. The only place that they give money, the only communal association is these churches. And that's why I spoke about them, because they're churches, but they're not churches in the way that the Chicago school talks about them. They're not rooting institutions. They're not building community around them. In fact, they're doing just the opposite.
All right, thank you very much. We can take one more round of questions. Yes, there's a hand. Where's the hand? Yeah, at the back. And then Stefan and the... Yeah, so...
Thank you very much, Loren. I thought that was really a fascinating presentation, which demonstrates an enormous breadth of knowledge and really attentive to social class and social realities. My question is, how would your analysis look any different if you explicitly, as opposed to implicitly, gendered it? So you make reference in passing to notions of being liberated from patriarchy or Louise White's work, but what would a fuller gendered analysis look like in terms of temporality, informality, and translocality?
Then Stefan, in the black shirt. Yeah.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Stefan Rother here from MIASA, but I'm not speaking in my own capacity because, as you notice, or as you're aware of, we are streamed live, and I received a question via Twitter, which I would like to pose now, by my dear colleague, Dr. Lucy Pedrosa, who is from Mexico, but based in Berlin now, so we are truly global at the moment. The good thing about the question is it's very short because it's a tweet. The problem is it's very dense to comprehend. So I hope I'm reading it out once and then maybe the condensed version. So is the political inclusion of migrants in localities, local polities, based on legal residence only, or is it rather an expression of it, like islands of membership? That's a very condensed version.
What was the last part?
Is the political inclusion of migrants in local polities based on legal residence only, or is it not rather an expression of this, like the islands of membership concept? I hope that is clear for now.
Yeah, just behind Jesper, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this really brilliant presentation. I have a question. Maybe you didn't get time to talk about it, and it's not your topic actually. But I'm interested in the concept of temporality. While talking about temporality, you present us a whole range of cities, and really very interesting presentation. For example, Lagos and Chicago, or Nairobi and Kuala Lumpur. The point is whether you could comment on the becoming of Chicago in the way a city like Lagos is evolving now. So taking the dimension of historicity, of temporality, and not comparing them now and here, but in this historicity.
All right, so for the sake of time, it looks like we might not get the chance to have another round, so we'll just take Nunu's question as the final question. You didn't want to ask it? Okay, so then it goes to Faisal, please.
Thank you very much. Faisal Garba, University of Cape Town and MIASA. Two interrelated questions. So the first is multiple forms of belonging. And here I want to go back to that example you gave of the Yoruba chief in Kano and the use of chieftaincy. I have to say that's really not new in terms of the formation of political community in West Africa. It is how instances of patronage operate, but also how communities get formed and how people at particular moments try to call on notions of tradition in processes of change. Now, that's not an idle point because it relates to that question about historicity. What is it about concrete local realities, okay, that shape how transformations are tailored, okay? And the second point is about the churches. Now, I think one has to differentiate this evolving African city and realize that these churches, the charismatic churches, were products of a particular moment in the history of sub-Saharan Africa, the desecration of livelihoods, late 70s, early 80s, and the use of churches as sites for accumulation. But related to your point about people's sense of belonging is, I think if one takes the concept of community, the Ummah in Islam, as it operates at least in the Sahel and West Africa, and the community, you know, as it is evolving in Christianity in this part of the world, then perhaps outside of what the Chicago School gave as determinants of belonging, there's another route towards belonging that one has to take seriously, and I just want your reflection on that.
Is that enough? Yeah, I think that's enough. Yeah. All right, let me my notes are now almost as disorganized as my thinking, so I'm going to try to get at these various questions. Let me start with the question about how Chicago might shape what's happening in Lagos. And it is not something that I necessarily know, but I can tell you that when I speak to urban planners, they very much look at these cities as their ideals, right, which are quite disconnected from the kind of social, institutional, economic realities. So there is a kind of, I think, a kind of demonstration effect that continues to inform the sort of spatial form, the types of building that they're trying to do. And but beyond that, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that when you also look, when you speak to people who have an imagination of what the American city is, what American popular culture, European popular culture is, you see that also resonated with the kinds of performance, the styles of dress. They're indigenized, but they continue to be in a kind of conversation over space and somehow over time. But I'd be interested to hear what you think about that a little bit more. Alan, in terms of a gendered analysis, I think we've been trying to do some of that also, and a lot of the focus on kind of African cities has tended to, and mobility particularly, has focused on young men who are have historically been the kind of pioneers, the people who go to cities, and that's no longer the case. I think the more you try to diversify the people you speak to, whether it's based on gender, generation, sexuality, whatever, you're going to see a lot of different sort of stories, different temporalities, different kind of trajectories, all in a very close space. And that's part of what I was getting at. The further you dig down, the less you're going to start seeing sort of shared ideals, shared notions of a common future. Women have a certain type of script they're often expected to follow, and they may have incorporated into their own thinking, which is different from men. Those are all going to generate different kind of measures for themselves of what they should do, what they can do. What we've seen with women, for example, is more heightened disconnection in the city, because what they have to do in the city is not a respectable activity back home. And so a real tension between trying to remain respectable at home, but also needing to be disconnected so that people back home don't really know what they're doing. But I think that it's an excellent question and definitely an area for more research. Pfizer, in terms of so the churches, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. They are a form of community, but it's not it's not typically a space-bound community, is what we've seen. It's often a translocal imagination, sometimes a kind of post-terrestrial imagination, that you're really just preparing yourselves for an onward journey, but that journey is not on this planet, right? You know, and so because that is your future, you don't have to worry about what's going on around you, and the people who have not seen the light, you don't have to worry about them either, right? It's a form of disconnection and community building at the same time, but one that is obviously linked to the space where the churches meet and the people are from, but also generates a kind of translocal or consciousness. In terms of the chief, you're right, and I think, you know, we've all talked about for generations the way in which Africans oscillate and remain connected to the village, etc. I think what you're starting to see now is a diversification of that. So in that sense, the Kano example is maybe not the best, because it's kind of an old one, but you're starting to see similar processes like that, where people are trying to maintain respectability and authority in multiple sites. So some of the Congolese in Johannesburg trying to remain respectable in Kinshasa by having sending money to DJs or to weather announcers so that they'll get their name read, but at the same time preparing and trying to remain respectable in a political movement based in the banlieues in Paris, all at one time, this kind of compression of multiple spaces into one person and one life. And I think that is something that, as African diasporas grow or people move more and more, and as they become more and more precarious in their lives, they're trying to multiply the chances of success by keeping a foot in two. It was easy to keep a foot in 2 locations because you have 2 feet, but now they have to keep a foot in like 7 locations at once. And that is part of, I think, of the new realities that are emerging. So in terms of, let me not forget our colleague in Berlin, Mexican colleague in Berlin, if I got it right? In terms of, and I'll end with this, in terms of is legal membership the basis of political recognition? The simple answer to that is no. I mean, legal recognition in the work that we've done offers very little in terms of protection. A recognition that people have a right to occupy a space is often valuable, but what we've seen over and over again is that legal recognition and the kind of legalization, if you want, of these sort of informal spaces, the slums, the estuaries, tends to mean that as soon as it's legalized, as soon as people have rights in that space, as soon as the area becomes titled, that's when the developers move in. That's when the middle classes move in, because then their rights are protected. Oddly, the thing that protects people and allows them to stay in the city longer is the fact that these areas are unsafe for capitalism in that kind of way. And I think, again, it's why we need to think through the kind of calls that we make for legalization, for formal recognition, can actually do more harm than good. Thanks. Coco.
All right, so thank you very much. You agree with me that this was a very interesting keynote address given by Loren, and I want to request that you join me in appreciating his effort, and yeah. So the plan is for us to now retire for a coffee break or a cocoa break. We'll resume at 10:45 for the next panel, the panel 3. The third panel, which will be chaired by Mary Setrana. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's a lot.
Wow. Thanks for the questions. What? The big questions. Yeah.
Very huge big questions. I dealt with them fantastically.